I'm going to talk really quickly about Cold War historiography. You guys might need some of this on an IB exam. If it's appropriate, if you have that question about the origins of the Cold War, you might want to drop in some school of Cold War historiography that supports your views. All right? So there's generally 4 schools of thought that we're going to talk about. And I'm talking from the American perspective. The first is the Orthodox view. Whenever we're talking about the historiographical record, the orthodoxy is like maybe the original or mainstream viewpoint as to why something happened or why something is the way it is. And as for Americans, the Orthodox view with the origins of the Cold War is that the Soviet Union was solely responsible for the origins of the tensions of the Cold War. It's all of their fault. That the Soviet Union was an expansionist state, and that the United States was only acting defensively. So the Truman Doctrine was a defensive measure against Soviet-supported protests in Greece and Turkey. That the Marshall Plan was a defensive measure against Soviet-sponsored communist parties in France and Italy, for example. That NATO was a defensive measure against the threatening Soviet states in Eastern Europe. And an important historian of this orthodoxy is a guy named Arthur Schlesinger. L-E-S-I-N. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Probably the most prominent American historian of the mid-20th century. And he was a proponent of this Orthodox view. But it's probably wrong to say he was a proponent, because every American historian was a proponent of this Orthodox view. Because as we're going to talk about within the next couple weeks, what happens if you are an American historian working at an American university if you don't have this view, Kevin? You could very well be blacklisted. You guys hear about the blacklistings in Hollywood, right? You guys read Johnny Got His Gun last year, right? And you know, Dalton Trumbo was an important screenwriter who was also known to have communist leanings and attended Communist Party meetings. And he was blacklisted from Hollywood. There's a new movie coming out about this, right? You guys hear about this? Where Walter White is going to be playing Dalton Trumbo. Very excited about that, yeah. So you had to be towing this line. You had to be carrying this story with you. So most histories written in the 1940s and 1950s share in the United States this Orthodox view. In the 1960s, things changed. Because in the 1960s, America is starting to change. Got a lot of things going on that are leading to this change. To start talking about the change in American colleges where a lot of these professors work, to start talking about these changes, we have to actually go back a little bit earlier to the Second World War, and at the end of the Second World War, the GI Bill. You guys remember mentioning this? The GI Bill providing, money for guys coming home from war for college, money to start businesses, low interest loans so they could buy homes. So you can imagine these millions of American servicemen coming home from the war, finding their sweethearts maybe, or meeting new sweethearts, and quickly settling down to start families because the government's helping you out to get a leg up on American society. You can buy an affordable house, right? You've got maybe money saved up from your wartime earnings. Your family back home, and maybe your future wife, has a lot of money saved up because she was working during the war. Or at least, if she wasn't working, she certainly wasn't spending a lot of money because there weren't consumer goods during the war to spend a lot of money on. So after World War II, we have this demographic shock in the United States known as the baby boom. You guys have heard of this? When from 1945, 46, 47, and later, the United States is going to have a dramatic growth in the number of children being born. Well, if you do the math, by the mid-1960s, a lot of these baby boomers are going to be getting into college, right? And they're heading, so we have by the 1960s, the number of Americans going to universities tremendously growing. And not just the traditional people that went to university, because after World War II, with the GI Bill, it wasn't going to be just the traditional Americans going to university. Traditional Americans going to university was relatively upper-class white American men. But after World War II, you're going to have a lot of middle class and lower class. And maybe not all white men, because African Americans can benefit from the GI Bill as well. So you're going to get more and more people going to college, and they're going to have their own children who are going to be encouraged to go to college. And by the 1960s, American colleges are going to start to look a little bit different. This is happening at the same time when more and more Americans are now starting to question the actions of our government. The United States government was not earning a lot of goodwill with regard to its treatment in the Vietnam War, its handling of the Vietnam War. We'll talk about this later in the year, but there's absolutely some times during the Vietnam War, even in the early 60s, or even in the mid-60s, where Americans started to question what they were being told by their government. And this hadn't really happened before. So you get new people going to college, and you get new questions about America's role in the world, and this is going to equate to a new way to look at the Cold War. All right? You also have a lot of new studies happening in these colleges. For example, history departments now started to cater more to the new students that were coming into their schools. So African American history classes, or Latino American studies classes, or Native American studies classes, or gender studies classes. These never existed before in colleges and universities. They're going to start by the late 1960s. They're going to start popping up. All right? And a lot of these classes will spend time talking about issues that didn't previously have a lot of time spent on them, like oppression of minorities, or anti-imperialism, for example. And so a lot of these students studying or listening to professors teaching them are going to start looking at the Cold War in a very different way. And we call this the revisionist school of Cold War historiography. Now, the existence of the revisionists does not mean that the orthodox is gone. All right? The orthodoxy still exists. But now we just have a new page of Cold War historiography. Some new thinking. And the revisionists, with regard to the Cold War, say that it was the United States that was responsible for this war. That the Americans were expanding our reach. That the Marshall Plan was merely American dollar diplomacy. Because the United States needed to continue growing the capitalist world. And so the revisionists take more of an anti-American stance with regard to the Cold War origins. But by the 1960s, the worst of the Red Scare had ended. You could be an American university professor and speak out against American actions and not be held accountable for it, not be punished for it, like you would have been in the 1950s. A proponent of this Cold War ideology is a guy named William Appleman Williams. William Appleman Williams. If your parents give you the same first and last name, they have to put in a cool middle name for you. So William Appleman Williams. Maybe it's not that cool, but whatever. So if you guys want to read a little bit more about this way of thinking, you can look him up and find out what he had to say about the Cold War. By the 1980s, we start to see some historians synthesizing the views of the orthodoxy and the revisionists to create a post-revisionist school of historiographical thought with regard to the origins of the Cold War. That neither side is completely to blame. And both sides hold some responsibilities. That each side misunderestimated the other. Like had misconceptions. We weren't really understanding. Maybe had the United States been able to wrap its head around better what the Soviet Union really went through in World War II, we might have been a little bit more understanding or maybe have found better common ground. The most prominent American historian of this school of thought is that John Lewis Gaddis. We already read of him. Gaddis, Gaddis. He started his work in the 1980s. Today, and really since 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we have a new school of thought called the post-Cold War historians. They're writing after the Cold War ends. And what benefit do these historians have over earlier historians? They know how it ends, sure. They're not going to be held accountable by either side anymore for speaking maybe poorly about how that would have, who started it or whatnot, because the event is over. Yes, sir?
They have some in the Soviet archives.
Very good. After 1991, when the Soviet Union falls, Soviet archives will be opened up more than they ever had before, certainly to Western historians. So a guy like Dr. Reddish at Wayne State, he can go to Russia now, and he can look through Soviet documents. John Lewis Gaddis can do the same. When he was writing in the 80s, he didn't have that access. Now, after the 90s, he does. That's why he writes in 2006 a new book called The Cold War, A New History. And these things can still come out to this day. They really mesh a lot of what the the revisionists and the Orthodox historians say. But upon getting into the documents, especially a guy like Gaddis, we see in the post-Cold War story, Joseph Stalin probably taking more of the blame than any other individual. Joseph Stalin's paranoia, Joseph Stalin's skepticism of Western intentions, leading to the greatest escalation of the Cold War. And I think you could really look at the story of the Berlin blockade and see that most clearly. Obviously, in the Soviet Union, these stories are kind of flipped on their ear. If you're an Orthodox Soviet historian, who do you believe started the Cold War? The Americans. If you're a revisionist Soviet historian, who do you believe started the Cold War? Well, no, you didn't exist. You were just like American historians in the 50s weren't free to write a revisionist history. Soviet historians were never really free to write that story. After the fall of the Cold War, you do start to see that, but they would just fit into the post-Cold War story like everything else. More recently in the Soviet Union as well, Joseph Stalin is getting more and more blame for the escalation of the Cold War.